Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with you. You and I have a track record, I think, of finding the doable where we can build consensus on a bipartisan basis. There will be a few areas where we disagree today, but I look forward to our discussion today on the effect of the tax code on individuals and families as they work, save, and invest. The scope of today's hearing provides members the opportunity to cover a broad range of topics. And we will no doubt hear a number of concerns raised about how the code treats high-income taxpayers. We should dispel the notion that there is any support for taxpayers who evade their tax obligations. We all agree that taxpayers should pay the tax they legally owe. Senator Wyden indicated what he's talking about is legally undertaken activities. And for the gray areas of taxpayers who aggressively structure their affairs to reduce their tax liability, we should constantly assess how the code can better and more fairly target activities. But framing this issue through the subjective lens of fairness often ignores the facts and turns a blind eye to favored initiatives or incentives. Rather than focusing on rhetoric, we should examine the data and how the code affects behavior. That includes examining provisions that primarily benefit a select group of the financially well-off, including tax credits for those who can afford expensive electric vehicles, costly energy home efficiency upgrades, and proposals to repeal the cap or expand the highly regressive deduction for state and local taxes. All of these primarily benefit the wealthy. As for the data, these are the indisputable facts. Most of the federal tax burden is paid by high earners. Federal tax collections have been near all-time highs. The voluntary tax compliance rate is high and stable, and higher income taxes serve as disincentives to work, save, and invest. My Republican colleagues and I remain focused on safeguarding taxpayers and their rights, reducing barriers to work, savings, and investment, and promoting opportunity and wealth to improve the quality of life for all Americans. In 2017, the Republicans lowered individual tax rates across the board, with middle-income taxpayers getting the largest proportional benefit. Republicans also simplified filing for many, expanded the child tax credit, and limited regressive tax spending like the SALT deduction. Critics charged that letting Americans keep more of their earnings would stifle the economy, dry up federal revenue, and favor the wealthy. Instead, it created one of the strongest economies in our nation's history, including an unemployment rate that reached a generational low, increased federal tax collections to near all-time highs, grew wages across the income spectrum, and expanded job participation. All Americans benefited. Notwithstanding claims that high earners pay the least taxes, the reverse is actually true. According to the Biden Treasury Department, in 2023, the top 1% of all earners paid 42% of all federal income taxes, the highest despite only earning 19% of all of the income. In 2001, the top 1% of earners contributed 33.2% of income tax revenue, 9 points lower. In other words, the country's income tax burden is more progressive today than it was decades ago. Expanding the aperture to examine the top 5% of taxpayers, those with incomes above $200,000 a year, mirrors this same dynamic. Those Americans pay 65.3% of all federal income taxes, while making only 34% of all income. Meanwhile, federal tax collections have reached an all-time high of $4.9 trillion in fiscal year 2022, with individual income tax collections contributing the most, growing by 29% year over year. In fact, individual income tax collections reached 10.5% of GDP in fiscal year 2022, the highest level on record. All of this is after the impact of the Republican-led tax reform. In arguing for tax code fairness, some have pointed to a recent tax gap projection from the IRS, which shows an increase over the previous estimate. This growth actually shows one of the many effects of inflation. Despite headlines to the contrary, the tax gap is proportionately flat and historically average relative to the economy's size. According to the Cato Institute's examination of the tax gap as a percentage of GDP, for 2021, that ratio was 2.9%, squarely in line with the 20-year average. And the voluntary tax compliance rate, around 85%, remains substantially unchanged. While we should work to find bipartisan measures to narrow that tax gap, any such effort must not reduce economic growth. I look forward to hearing the perspectives of today's witnesses on how the individual tax system affects taxpayers from all income groups and how increased taxes in the midst of high and sustained inflation would impact our economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.